Welcome to another video from theplayersaid.com. My name is Grant, and today I'm continuing a series that Alexander actually started. It is called From Cover to Cover. It, in essence, is a book overview, review, and then a paired discussion with one or several games on that topic. This is now my second video, and I've been having fun doing them. I used to read a lot, and life has gotten in the way, and then we got this blog and war game thing going on, and I've just kind of put that to the side for a while. I've read a little bit, but not nearly as much as I used to or even wanted to. But recently I've picked up some books, read some books from my collection. Today is a book and a game pairing that is in my collection. So without further ado, with this edition of From Cover to Cover, I am going to cover The Longest Winter. This is a book written by Alex Kershaw. It is a narrative style historical record, meaning he uses, as much as he possibly can, eyewitness accounts, first person explanations and narratives, even back and forth communications from various interviews with those who were involved in this battle. It's very well done. I think it works very well. I was kind of joking with Alexander as I read different books. I realized that I actually prefer a little drier, a little more based in the historical facts and situation and movements and maneuvers, numbers, than I do historically focused narrative style books, which is odd. I think a couple of years ago that may not have been the way I felt, but I think I've started to really, maybe it's as I've gotten older, I have a little more less time, so I want to read things that to me are very, very interesting. And to me, I'm more focused on those numbers, the number side of any conflict or struggle. But I really very much enjoyed this book. I'm very glad that I read this. This came to me by way of a recommendation from David Thompson. He is a designer, great fellow, lives in Ohio. We've actually been to his house and played some games, and then we've interviewed him several times on the YouTube channel, on the blog, and then played many of his games, probably 8 or 9. In fact, I have an entire David Thompson collection over here to my left on one of my shelves. And one of the games I'm going to talk about today is focused literally on this very historical engagement. But David recommended this book. It was a book that he read as a part of the design process for the game called Lanzerath Ridge. I'll talk about that here a little bit more in a moment. But I want to talk about the book first, and by no means is this a page-by-page, chapter-by-chapter summary of the book, but I wanted to make sure that I at least cover some of the highlights, some of the things that stood out to me, and things that I felt were very interesting about this battle. So, The Longest Winter is set in the village of Lanzerath. It is kind of on the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, the very famous Battle of the Bulge during World War II, where the Germans basically pulled everything that they could off of the East Front, and Hitler had an idea that he wanted to enforce attack the advancing Allied armies as they were coming off of D-Day and had been making their way through Western Europe and approaching the fatherland itself, the Maginot Line and the Rhine River. He decided that he wanted to have kind of a final glorious counterattack, and that's what ultimately led to the Battle of the Bulge. And it was a massive attack. In fact, most American and British forces at that time were overmatched, overwhelmed, outnumbered, outgunned, outsupplied, and really weren't ready for this attack. I think that nobody thought it would come. In fact, one of the very interesting things that was pointed out in some of the earlier chapters was that some of the men who were stationed along the front for weeks had been seeing and hearing movements of German vehicles and artillery seeing men in the shadows as they were kind of reconnoitering the front lines and trying to understand where the Americans and the British, the Allied troops, were set up. So there was intelligence that kind of led some to believe that, hey, something is coming, but basically Allied command didn't believe that was the case, didn't believe that the Germans at that point could mount any type of a serviceable attack force that would do any damage or threaten them. So they were kind of lackadaisical about it, I think, is probably a kind term. And by way of example, the platoon that we're focused on in this book, and I'm going to read it just to make sure that I get it right, because I'm terrible at these kind of small details. So it's the INR platoon, which stands for Intelligence and Recon Platoon, of the 394th Regiment of the 99th Infantry Division. So that is the small company of men that we are focused on. In fact, I believe there were 22 of them stationed on Lanzerath Ridge, and they were not a frontline combat force. They were intended to kind of reconnoiter oncoming troops and positions and report back to division headquarters about what was happening, what was going on. They were basically supposed to set up observation posts and just communicate. But ultimately that didn't end up working out, and they were really frontline troops that had to defend, initially at least, in that area or region, what was considered a fairly powerful attacking force, Panzer Division, the Piper Panzer Division SS, who had many tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and Panzers who would try to move in that area and really overwhelm them. But they ultimately ended up becoming a frontline defense force. So that's the division and the company that we are focused on in this book. 22 individuals that were really stationed there. They only had a couple of casualties, and by casualties I mean fairly serious injuries, facial injuries. I'll talk a little bit about those. Bill James was shot 3 or 4 times at close range by a German Fallschirmjäger burpee gun, is what they called it, kind of a sub-machine gun. But he was shot at close range and lost his eye and was thought to be dead. And then Khalil was also shot kind of oddly. He was in a building, an observation post, and was ultimately shot in the face by a rifle grenade from a Fallschirmjäger unit. It kind of went through the slit, hit him in the jaw, broke his teeth, crushed his teeth actually up into the roof of his mouth, but didn't kill him. I think knocked him unconscious, but ultimately he was captured, as was Bill James. They were captured, and they had a different experience after the battle. But the book is really divided into 4 parts. Just to give a summary, high-level overview of that. The first probably 5 chapters is a look at the situation of the Germans and Hitler's thinking right after the assassination attempt at the Wolf's Lair on the East Front, where the bomb was placed by Tom Cruise. Not Tom Cruise, but by that cabal who was trying to destroy Hitler to save the fatherland, basically. That bomb exploded. Hitler was alive, injured but alive, and therefore felt that Providence had spared him, and that he was called, like the Viking heroes of the past and like Frederick the Great, to go out in a blaze of glory and mount this huge offensive to potentially, it was supposed to drive the Allies back west, split them in 2, drive on to the sea in Antwerp, Belgium, and really cut off their supply source there and drive them back across the channel to England. It didn't quite work that way, and we all know history. Obviously, the very beginning of the attack was very powerful, but it petered out over time. But the first part of the book was divided amongst a couple of chapters on that fact and issues, some of the mobilizations. It also was focused on and I always really enjoy where stories Band of Brothers, where we start out at the training camp of the division or the squad or whatever we're discussing about in the narrative. Camp Maxey, and I think it was in California, if I'm not mistaken, a very warm climate where these men trained together, learned their craft. They were called 99ers because they were part of the 99th Infantry Division. And the ones that were chosen for this INR platoon were actually smart individuals who had done well on test and testing and were kind of specifically chosen for their skill sets to fill out this INR regiment to serve this specific purpose. So started in Camp Maxey, and as you can imagine, lots of interesting stories about their interactions. Leaders began to develop. Lyle Bauk is a main character in the book. He is kind of a leader, a de facto leader, I think, at first, but ultimately later on became squad or a leader, a lieutenant. I think he ultimately rose to the level of lieutenant. The other leader is Milosevic, a Serbian family who had moved to escape the German onslaught in the 30s and 40s, came to America. He volunteered and was a great leader, a great fighter. So kind of those two guys really formed the backbone. There were others, Redmond, Ford, lots of good guys who were good leaders. But I think those two were what I would consider the main focus of the book. I think they had a lot of great insight to give when they were interviewed by Alex Kershaw, and therefore provided what I think was a really great insight into that training experience and how the men formed up and formed relationships, became close, and ultimately a band of brothers who traveled over to Europe. They traveled over to England, where they were stationed for a month or so. As D-Day unfolded, actually they came after D-Day, but as D-Day unfolded and the breakout was on, around October, they were deployed onto the eastern part of that Western theater as the Allies kind of moved closer and closer into Belgium and into the Maginot Line, and as they foresaw kind of crossing over the Rhine River and into Germany and taking the fight to the Germans themselves. So they were deployed like in mid to late October, November, and as they continued to train, the interesting thing was they complained a lot about the cold because they had trained in California, and you can imagine California pretty much all the time is in the 70s and 80s, very temperate climate, low humidity, not cold at all. And then here they were thrown into sub-zero weather in November and December on the Western Front in Belgium and the Ardennes, and it was just very much cold. So they did talk a lot about that. That was a part of that discussion. So that was really the first part, that training and development of the men and their leadership. The second part of the book kind of was split between the side of Piper, his command, and his division as they were given the assignment to break through to the Meuse River, capture it, cross it, and split the Allies in half. And he had quite a few crack troops. He had seasoned, hardened SS fighters from the East Front who had been transitioned over. Also had several companies of Fallschirmjäger troops, which are airborne troops, a little better trained, a little more elite or considered elite. So they focused on his plan, and then they also focused on the ultimate setup for the defense of Lanzerath Ridge and the Elsenborn Ridge later after Lanzerath was captured. And the battle took place in that part of the book. The battle really was about an 18-hour affair, so over a day and a half, as the Germans approached the fairly dug-in positions of these 22 men in that INR platoon. They were supported by artillery, not necessarily a lot of artillery. They did not have a lot of vehicles. They had a couple of Jeeps that had machine guns attached to them, and I think some steel plates welded on them to kind of act as protection. They also kind of controlled the village and a couple of buildings, and were ultimately therefore able to fire on the advancing Germans, who had to come up the slope, had to navigate through a couple levels of barbed wire fence that had been set up. The GIs also had dug in quite a few foxholes and fortified them with branches and wood, therefore to be able to fire from a prepared and protected position. And we all know that gives huge DRMs in war games, and ultimately it led to the 22 defenders being able to hold off that Fallschirmjäger and the Panzer Grenadier advance for 18 hours. They had, I think it was 4 different assault periods over that time. The first 2, I believe, were all frontal assaults, and the Fallschirmjäger took significant losses. They had about 300 to 350 men, and probably lost a third of that over the first 4 assaults. So what is that, 100 men wounded and killed? It was interesting also because the INR platoon had a couple of machine guns, a couple of rifle-mounted grenades, and that was about it. The rest of them, they had a couple BARs and then M1 Garands. So not a lot of firepower. They had grenades. They had set up grenade tripwires at certain points so that if the Fallschirmjägers would flank them, they would hit those, they could pull those and kind of booby traps that would stop the advance. And all of that worked, like I said, for 18 hours, but ultimately they had to continually fall back. They had a central command post or building that basically Lyle Bauk, as the lieutenant, was holed up. With him was Bill James, and then I think I mentioned Khalil, and I think it was Redmond, also were in nearby buildings. They continued to fight until they basically ran out of ammunition. A couple of those men tried to escape kind of through the back way. They were ultimately intercepted as the area was enveloped by the advancing Germans. So they didn't make it out. They were all captured, but no one, fortunately, was killed at that time. But there were significant wounds. I already talked about Khalil's taking a rifle grenade to the face. When he was captured, they shipped him north to, I can't remember where, but some hospital camps where he could gain. I thought that was interesting that the Germans would at least do that for those that were severely wounded. And then Bill James, who I already mentioned, took the burpee gun to the face, literally point blank. And it was a very sad story. I'll share it with you really quickly, but they were inside the building, Lyle Bauk and him. They had almost no ammunition left, couldn't really defend themselves. I think they had a grenade or two. They kind of fought the Germans off at the door, threw a grenade out the side door, but then they just kept coming. Ultimately, a Fallschirmjäger came in through the back door with that burpee gun, pointed it at Lyle Bauk. Lyle Bauk very deftly kind of deflected that off to the right, and ultimately the trigger was pulled and it released several rounds into Bill James, who was right there to the side. So I know Lyle Bauk felt guilty about that at the time and later on, because ultimately he thought he killed his friend, but ultimately Bill survived, had multiple surgeries, but ultimately survived to old age, where he struggled with pain and I think addiction to painkillers, because he had significant pain all the time in later life, even after the surgeries. But kind of a sad story. But those men that were injured were shipped to the north. The others were kind of rounded up, put into cattle cars, right, rail cars that ultimately went further to the east into Germany itself, and then they actually held them in several different stalags. They had numbers. I think one was 13, one was 70. But as the Allies continued to advance on the front, they had to continually evacuate and move them. So that was the second part of the book, the battle. I think it's important to note here, and one of the reasons they were so highly decorated after the fact was that 22 brave men, outmanned, outgunned, outmaneuvered, outflanked, held off the initial start of the German, let's call it spear point, right? And they referred to it in the book as blunting the spear point of that invasion. Piper was held off 18 hours by these guys, and that put him behind schedule. Ultimately, it made him not be able to reach the bridges over the Meuse in time. In fact, one of the times he did reach the bridge, one of the bridges, the Allies were there and blew it up, forcing him to then go around to another bridge like 20 miles down the river that ultimately I think was blown up as they approached. So the INR platoon and their defensive abilities and fierce fighting and bravery and courage held up that advance, gave the Allies enough time to kind of reorganize, establish a system on the Lanzerath Ridge specifically, form up, and be able to repulse ultimately that invasion in that part of Belgium. Just a truly historic story of bravery, courage, hard fighting, good leadership, good friendship, that ultimately led into them all being captured. So that was part 2 of the book. Part 3 was they followed Lyle Bauch and several of his other close comrades in his stalag, and then it also kind of went back and forth between Khalil and James as they were in a hospital receiving treatment. So that part 3 was really, it was called Winter and Spring in the Reich. So they went from camp to camp. In those camps, as we all know, sometimes the Germans were utterly brutal. They did not feed them very well. In fact, a normal healthy man in the army needed 2,000 to 2,500 calories, if not more, to sustain themselves into a fighting force. In those camps, they were lucky if they got 1,200 calories, and in fact, a lot of the time they got sub 1,000, 750, 800 calories. A couple of pieces of moldy black bread, maybe some broth, but that was, and some potatoes, moldy potatoes. That was really about all they ate. So as they ate that over, late December, January, February, March, and into late April, and even early May, the men lost significant body weight. Most of them lost anywhere from 30 to 40% of their body weight. They would go into that camp being 160, 180, 200, and ultimately would come out 100, 110, 120 at the end when they were liberated. And really their bravery in working together, one of the things that stood out to me a lot about the first person accounts was particularly Lyle Bauch, Lyle's focus on being positive, making the best of the situation, trying to have camaraderie, reminding everyone, hey, I know everyone's sick. They all had dysentery. Many of them had hepatitis. There were 30-minute long waits to go to the bathroom, and many of them were going to bathroom on themselves. But they reminded each other that we're in this together. We're brothers, we're Americans, we're friends. We've trained together. Let's help each other. And ultimately, in the camps that these men were in, that was ultimately the outcome. They did work together. They loved each other. They cared for each other. They helped each other and shared food, which was interesting. If one man was doing better, he would sometimes give his portion over to someone who wasn't doing as well. Just that was very, very touching to me. I'm an emotional person. I think that brought me to tears a couple of times as I read that in that third part or group of the book. But ultimately, they continued to have to fall back. They were attacked by P-51s and strafed, and mosquito bombings would happen, and some of them were killed, some of them were shot up, and the Germans weren't really great about helping them. In fact, many of the men would be able to run out of holes in the fences during these raids, get out into the fields, lay down for cover, and then literally come back because they had nowhere to go. It was the middle of winter, snow was on the ground, it was wet and cold. Many of them had frostbite, many of them had hepatitis, dysentery, as I've already said, and they really couldn't go very far. But they hung on, and as they would catch rumors of the Allied advances, they would be emboldened and strengthened, and they would have confidence that they were going to get home. It was also touching to me that there was a chaplain in and he held regular services, and men who would not have said they were religious were now trying to be humble and appeal to our Heavenly Father to help and protect them. And ultimately, in the end, many of them were rescued and saved and returned to their normal lives. So, very touching aspect and episode. Now, the fourth part of the book really focused on Patton's army coming into this area. In fact, they called one of it Task Force Baum, who Patton appointed a man by the name of Baum who took a small force and tried to liberate this stalag where Lyle Balk and most of his men were. It didn't go well. They rescued some of the men, but ultimately were captured, some of them themselves, and were killed. So that was kind of a wasted effort, but ultimately Patton did liberate the camp and all of the camps. And as they moved forward to the Alps, they were afraid the SS were going to fight to the very death, but ultimately they surrendered after hearing word that Hitler had committed suicide and burned his body. They had burned his body in Berlin as the Soviets and the Americans kind of advanced on the positions. But very interesting as the war came to an end. Their war was over, but their struggle wasn't over. Many of them had to recuperate. You know, and it's the same old thing when you haven't eaten regularly for months and months and months. Your stomach has shrunk. Your body can't absorb minerals and vitamins from food. It can only take liquids for a while, and then it will build up to soft things like breads and potatoes. But these men, when they were rescued, they wanted to eat meat and beef and were fed all these things, and ultimately they stuffed themselves and would throw up and be warned by the doctors and the leaders there that you can't eat. I know you want to, but you can't eat all that stuff. That was very, very sad. But it was encouraging to see that almost all of the men from the INR platoon lived, recovered, had grievous wounds that they ultimately dealt with later in life. But I think their brotherhood, their friendship, and fellowship saved them over the course of this 7 or 8 months at the end of October 1944 through May of 1945 and the end of the war. Just a great book. And then ultimately the end of the story is they were never really called out for their heroic acts or bravery or the ability for them to hold off and kill 100 to 150 of the German troops and blunt that initial advance. But none of them gave up hope, and their wives and friends and even their leaders, I can't remember if he was corporal, he wasn't corporal, General Kriz, who was kind of over the 99th in that area, continually petitioned Congress to give these men their due and give them the Distinguished Service Crosses, and they all got Silver Stars and Congressional Medal of Honor. I think Milosevic got a Congressional Medal of Honor because literally at Lanzerath Ridge, he jumped on one of those mounted machine guns and literally just mowed down 40 or 50 advancing Germans to kind of stave off that assault. And that was very heroic and was worthy of that. In fact, all of their efforts were worthy of those medals. But they didn't get all those medals, and I think it was under Jimmy Carter in 1979. Many of them were still alive, but I think several of them had passed just because of old age in their 70s and into their 80s. So they ultimately never necessarily received the due that they were should have been given during life. But the end of the story was that they were given unit citations for the Battle of the Bulge and their acts at Lanzerath Ridge. It was recognized that their efforts saved thousands and thousands of Allied lives and ultimately allowed the Allies to continue the attack and force Germany to capitulate there in 1945. But just a great story. I really loved the book. One of my favorite parts in the book from a kind of an emotional standpoint was they did show several of the men's Western Union telegrams that were sent. So this one here that's specifically shown, I think was for Lyle Bouck. To Magdalene Bouck, who lived in Missouri. They sent him or his family a telegram on January the 5th of 1945, basically saying, your son is MIA. He's missing in action. We don't know where he is. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck has been reported missing. And then later on April the 11th, when he ultimately was liberated, some of the others were not. She got another telegram that said, we have found him. He was a prisoner of war by Germany and has been released. So I thought that was really touching, and as a father myself, I thought that was very touching because I could put myself in the place of those fathers and mothers as if my son would have served and would have been lost and we didn't know what excruciating pain that would have been to experience. They also showed a lot of and that's a very famous photo, obviously, of a German Fallschirmjäger soldier on the Battle of the Bulge. We all have seen that many, many times. But they showed actually a battle map. I can't remember where that is. Here's actually a photograph, kind of a USGS photo from the sky of the Lanzerath battlefield. And that was very cool to see their positions, where they were laid out, and the defensive formations they had fortifications they had created. But that ultimately, this book led to David Thompson. And I'm going to move the book over. I'll bring it back here as we close it out. But it led to David Thompson in Volume 4 of his Valiant Defense series from Dan Versen Games, a series of solitaire war games that use card activations and tracks upon which the Germans and enemies are advancing, and you have to kind of fight them off with limited numbers of actions, limited ammunition, etc., and men. But the game Lanzerath Ridge, Battle of the Bulge, came out in 2022. Fantastic game. This game is designed by David, but is illustrated by the very talented Nils Johansson. And before me is the board, and I think you can kind of see that. Let me move that over. It is utterly gorgeous. This is a board that is worthy to be framed and put up on the wall of anyone's game room. If you do not have this game, I urge you to look into it. It is a solitaire game that plays over 4 rounds, uses cards to activate the Germans and cause them to shoot mortars or machine guns or advance on the positions. Very cool system that is very fun. You can also add in tactics cards that just simply make the game that much more difficult. I've played it without them and actually won, meaning I survived and was ultimately still captured historically. But then I threw in those tactics cards, and holy mackerel, the games became much, much shorter and were not victorious, meaning I got killed quite often. But a very cool system, a very cool game. And one of the things that really touched me about the game and connecting with the book itself, all of the named individuals that were included in this 394th INR platoon of the 99th Infantry Division are named counters. So I've mentioned Lyle Bauk. I'm going to show you. Here's the Lyle Bauk counter. You can see that. He's a commander. He has a handsome fellow, by the way. Has a star in the upper right and a C, meaning he can take the command action to rest and recuperate other soldiers so that they can then take their actions again, firing their rifles, throwing grenades, shooting machine guns. But they're all called out. Here's Lyle Bauk. Here's Slape, who is another leader. Springer, who is another leader. And then the general soldiers themselves. Milosevic, James, McGahey, Silvola, Robinson, Khalil. This is the gentleman that took the rifle grenade to the face. Where is James? I wanted to call Bill James. I'm missing him. Here he is. Bill James, the one that took the burpee submachine gun to the face, losing an eye. Amazing. As I read this, I could remember their names from playing the game. And I actually, halfway through the book, got the game out, looked at it, and I was like, oh yeah, there's Milosevic. Just very cool to make that connection. And I think that's one of the greatest things about our hobby, history in itself, reading these kinds of books, and then playing these style of games. It brings those historical events down to a personal level, where we're moving these unit counters around this board from position to position and ultimately feeling some of the angst and fear and terror that these men would have felt under fire, being outmanned and outgunned and outmaneuvered. All of those things that would probably strike fear into most of our hearts, these men stood and fought. And I think the little bit of feeling that we can get from playing these games and reading these books, I think is a huge credit to the brave men who lived out these events. And I just absolutely love that about our hobby. Connecting history with a playable game that allows us to merge that together with the narrative and understand some way what these men were feeling. I just think that's an amazing, amazing thing. One thing I want to point out about the game that I really, truly enjoy, during the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge, there were some kind of quirky things that went on. The Germans had soldiers who had the medic armbands on, who were moving across the battlefield, checking on soldiers, Fallschirmjäger soldiers who had been shot. But they also were reporting back through some kind of comms system to the artillery units to try to bring those mortar fire and artillery fire onto the Americans and their defending positions. This was noticed by the men, and they ultimately took shots and killed several of those medics who were relaying that information. That was against the Geneva Convention, all of the standards of warfare in the time. And it was interesting because some of those men were brought up on court-martial charges later in the war for taking shots, and they were obviously absolved because of what the others' first-person narratives were able to share. But that's in this game. There are counters, and I'll show you a couple of them. There are medic counters. Here you can see these little medic counters, and they come, I think it's on the third wave of the invasion, and you can basically turn them over. Oh, this one is really a medic. Oh, this one's a forward observer and a spotter. Let's get rid of him. And you've got to get rid of them, or that fire becomes more effective on you. Awesome, awesome integration of that historical fact into the playable game itself. The other thing that I thought was very, very interesting was they had, remember I said they had those Jeeps that had mounted Browning machine guns and other on them. Ultimately, as the Germans came up the hill and neared the positions, the INR platoon began sabotaging the machine guns because they were out of ammo anyway, breaking the machine guns, breaking the Jeeps and destroying them, sabotaging them, so that ultimately the Germans could not use those against the Allied troops, which I think is fairly standard in warfare. But the game, you can turn those over to their damage side. You can actually damage them yourselves during that third and fourth wave, and you ultimately get victory points from successfully doing so. And frankly, if you don't do that and you don't find the medics, you're not going to make it through the fourth round. Typically, it's just too many units. So I think that's amazing that David was able to take out those little elements, put those historical elements into the game, and make it a fun, playable, and historical simulation of the Battle of the Bulge here at Lanzerath Ridge. So I would highly recommend this book. I think it's amazing. I enjoyed it. It took me about 2 weeks. It's just shy of 300 pages. When I read, I like to look at the pictures and the maps and kind of go back. And so it took me about 2 weeks, maybe 45 minutes to an hour here and there. Finished it, loved it, very much enjoyed it, and would very highly recommend this book. I got mine secondhand, cost me about $15 to $18, so I know you can find those at used book places. But I would highly recommend The Longest Winter by Alex Kershaw. This is published, let me see who it's published by. I don't remember who it's published by. Da Capo Press. And the price here is $16.99. I think I got it for that or less secondhand, and I might have got it off Amazon. But I highly recommend this book. I highly recommend this game from Dan Verson Games and David Thompson. So I very much appreciated your attention and watching this video. I hope it was informative, interesting. I hope it encourages you to get this book, read it, learn about the Battle of the Bulge, and then maybe even play this game if you have yet to experience. So thank you for watching this edition of From Cover to Cover. I've been Grant for the Player's Aid.